Welcome to another broadcast of Majoring in the Majors with Pastor S J Munson on the Artist First Radio Network. All past shows are available in podcast form. You can find them at artistfirst.com. Your host is the author of two books, The Treasure of Israel and Christ Held Hostage, the Hijacking of American Christianity. Here's your host, Pastor S J Munson.
Hi, this is Pastor S J Munson, and welcome to Majoring in the Majors. To start off tonight's broadcast, I would like to read a verse from the book of Revelation, chapter 7, verse 9. After this I looked, and there before me was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, tribe, people, and language, standing before the throne and before the Lamb. They were wearing white robes and were holding palm branches in their hands. "I hate it," our little one protested as she listed her reasons why she refused to go to Sunday school that morning. "It's boring," she continued. "No one plays with me," she added. We were still not impressed. Then, like Clancy, she lowered the boom, blurting out tearfully, "I'm the only one with brown skin." Since moving to the American South, my family and I had attended many churches in our effort to find a spiritual home. The churches we visited were all filled with sweet, hospitable people who could not have been more welcoming to us as a white couple with a biracial child. There was just one problem. All of these churches were either white or black. It was difficult enough trying to sift through the hundreds of good churches in our city. We knew we wouldn't find a perfect one, but having to settle for an all-white or all-black church, and we visited both, seemed just wrong. Finally, we thought we had found a church, and it seemed like the right decision at the time. Then our daughter gave us that wake-up call to jolt us out of our complacency. As a father, I felt both frustration over the racial ossification that so often strides hand-in-hand with Christianity in this country, and conviction over my own complicity in both the wider problem and my daughter's pain. In response to a question as to why the church was not taking more of a lead in the struggle for desegregation, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. remarked with sadness, "We must face the fact that in America, the church is still the most segregated major institution in America. At 11 o'clock on Sunday morning, when we stand and sing and Christ has no east or west, we stand at the most segregated hour in this nation." That was almost 60 years ago, and one wonders if we have made all that much progress. Today, 93% of U.S. churches are still basically segregated, meaning that more than 80% of their membership represents a single race or ethnicity. Churches here are also 10 times more segregated than their neighborhoods, 20 times more segregated than the public schools. Living in the South, where the subject of race is rarely broached among, what would you call polite society, one meets few people these days who seem openly racist. And yet, some 82% of white evangelicals quietly and privately voted for Donald Trump, an avowed racist and white supremacist, in the last two elections. What do you call that if not racism? What is the disconnect? The difficulty is that today, racism across this country is more often tacit than stated, complicit than active. It is expressed more in what we do and where we live, the relationships or schools we choose, than in what we say or consciously believe. Ironically, this form of racism is more prevalent among the most educated segment of the population, those who would least consider themselves to be racist, since affluence affords people more options regarding where they live and where they send their children to school. In his landmark study, Michael Emerson calls this phenomenon an example of racialization. Racialized societies produce disparate social outcomes for different racial groups. And of course, in saying this, I'm not referring to the politicians on the hard right who these days try to build their base by spewing racist filth and attempt to mainstream racism once again in this country as though this were the 1850s, let alone the 1950s. That's one kind of racism, but the other is much more insidious. How is it that in the 21st century, Christians, of all people, can still be so comfortable with the status quo of racial segregation. What seems most shocking is not that there are white churches and black churches, but that most of us seem content with the arrangement. Some contend that racial segregation in our churches is merely the result of different cultures and worship styles, that human beings are by nature more comfortable associating with those who are like themselves. Others in church growth circles may even go so far as to tout racial homogeneity as a major factor in church growth. Yet in a nation such as ours, with our obvious and painful history of racism, how can we claim that prejudice has no significant role in producing such outcomes? Or how can we deny statistics that show Protestant churches leading all other denominations, and indeed all other religions, in racial segregation? According to Emerson's 2006 estimate, only 5% of Protestant congregations are multiracial, compared to 15% of Catholic and 20% of non-Christian congregations. While many larger congregations are making inroads into the problem, and there is, I suppose, some hope for change, we cannot escape the fact that half a century after King's I Have a Dream speech, America's churches have relatively little to show for it. In his letter from Birmingham jail, written in 1963, Dr. King writes, "The Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. We will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the hateful words and actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence of the good people. People of goodwill, just plain decent folk. Where would the world be without us? We are the mainstay of every culture, a bulwark against moral depravity and anarchy, yet ironically, these same quiet, decent souls are the very backbone of racism in this country. Always have been and always will be. Frothing segregationists and white-robed supremacists may capture the headlines, but in the end they are but a carnival sideshow compared to the mighty destructive power of the decent folk like me, whose pressed white shirts and green lawns mask a savage indifference, a ruthless, murderous passivity. Slavery could not have endured so long without us, so warmly tucked in our beds in North and South. Jim Crow could not have kept its iron talons so firmly embedded for nearly a century. 8 million Jews could not have been so tidily eliminated without the blind complicity and willful ignorance of us, the infantry of inertia, the stalwarts of the status quo. There are many kinds of racism, as I've said. That there is the loudmouth, ignorant, bullying kind, like Commissioner Bull Connor, who loosed attack dogs on little black schoolgirls. There is the cowardly kind, who move in packs at night, protected by white sheets. There are those possessed of a dangerous eloquence that can sway millions, yet none of them could last a day without the silent blessing, apathy, or votes of us decent folks whose passive kind of racism outsmiles, outlabors, out-Herods all the rest. The Lucan narratives in the New Testament, that is, the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts, are filled with questions and confrontations about racial or cultural prejudice. Jesus seems to enjoy making Gentiles the heroes of many of his stories and healings, a choice he knows will absolutely infuriate his fellow Jews. Clearly, he sees his prophetic role as not to massage his listeners' prejudices, but to explode them. We have already seen many times how his parable of the Good Samaritan flies in the face of ethnic hatred. In Acts 10, even after receiving a clear vision from the Lord, Peter, the apostle, visits the Gentile home of a centurion somewhat grudgingly, and he is not silent about how uncomfortable he is. In his daring letter to the church at Galatia, the apostle Paul does not shy from exposing how Peter, this pillar of the church, conducted himself among Gentiles. At first, Peter ate freely and drank freely with them, and then pulled back when a fact-finding delegation from Jerusalem arrived. Even the chief apostle learns that prejudice is not something one can merely set aside. It must be crucified. In Acts chapter 6, Greek-speaking widows are being overlooked by an Aramaic-speaking church, and the decent folks who know about it apparently do nothing to stop it. For the average Palestinian Jew who spoke Aramaic, there was something inferior, untrustworthy, un-Jewish about diaspora Jews who spoke Greek. For centuries, little Judea had struggled to maintain its cultural and religious independence amid the brutal collision of empires, struggled and lost. And these Hellenistic Jews with their Greek language, Greek dress and customs seemed barely a step away from being Gentiles. Faced with a crisis, it may seem that the apostles merely passed the buck to a committee. Yet the larger church shows itself both decisive and farsighted in their choice of disciples to form this task force. Looking at the list of names of the men who were chosen, it becomes immediately evident that every one of them is Greek-speaking. A clear statement that the Jerusalem church would not tolerate intolerance. Today, we would probably see no need to take such drastic action. We might make sure that there is at least some minority representation on our committees while keeping the white majority unmistakably in charge. Not the Jerusalem church. They gave the minority 100% representation. They understood that the issue was not just one of language or culture, it was about power. They put a stop to the injustice by turning the power over to the disempowered. Many white churches in America are painfully aware of the problem of Sunday morning segregation, but have no actual strategy to change it. And if they're waiting for the day when 12 families of color magically walk through their doors, they'll be waiting a long time. Recently, I performed one of the most painful exercises I've ever undertaken, and no, I'm not talking about barbell lunges, in an effort to find a local church with a more racially diverse congregation. My wife and I went through almost the entire phone directory and looked up the various churches on the internet. Websites can be very revealing, and photos even more so. For example, a friend had recommended a certain large church downtown, claiming that an inner city church must surely have a diverse body. We looked at the church's website, but saw no evidence of people of color in the photos, not one. Then we looked at the church staff page and realized why. I'm sorry to say that of the 20 or so ministry and administrative staff positions, all of them were filled by white people. Every single one. The only people of color were on the custodial staff. If you spent the time to scroll down to the bottom of the page past the elderly ladies who make the sermon CDs, you might see them. What a statement is that? Sadly, in many parts of America, this is only too common. As white pastors, why would we expect a person of color to feel welcome or comfortable in our churches if we make no effort at all to reflect diversity in our staff, or at the very least in our worship team, our announcements, or what we present from the altar? Progress in this area, or the lack of it, speaks volumes about what we value as a congregation. Regardless of what one thinks about former President Obama's performance in office or his credibility problems among communities of color, we can't get away from the fact that electing a black president for the first time in our nation's history was a very powerful and empowering precedent for African Americans. It began to shatter centuries of paralyzing racism that claimed that such positions of power were a white privilege only. Now, some pastors of white churches may complain that there are no people of color in their congregations to promote two levels of leadership, and that is rather a passive argument. But let us suppose that we've done all that we can to reach out and attract minority communities without results. Another option would be to hire someone. Why is it we can employ a janitor with dark skin, entrusting him with all the keys to the building, but we can't add a qualified person of color to our staff? Or even hire someone to make announcements from the pulpit or lead worship? Of course, if we really want to follow the Acts model to the letter, we could make all of our deacons people of color in one sweep. Does that sound too drastic? All right. But I wonder if we really grasp the gravity of our situation. I mean, if our churches were on fire, would we not do whatever we could to extinguish the flames? Racism, even the passive variety, is a deeply rooted issue. It requires a deeply radical approach. And remember, the key is giving away power. One church in Orlando, Florida, has experienced explosive growth in the last many years. In addition to breaking down the color barrier, The congregation had been mostly white and middle class until they decided one day they wanted to be more inclusive. And they began by reaching out to people of color. Yet, once inside the door, the visitors were invited to do more than just fill seats. They were encouraged to serve in positions of responsibility. "It's not, 'I love you, here, sit down,'" said the pastor. You let them be in leadership," he said. Within 5 years, the church quickly grew to about 50% minority representation, with a membership of over 4,000. Another reason people of color may visit white churches but never stay long may lie in the tone and content of what is presented from the stage or pulpit. For example, churches wishing to break through the color barrier may need to consider a wider range of worship styles. People of color may also feel that whites have no concept of how they live and the things they deal with on a daily basis, and they're right. Many white churches spend time praising the United States of America as if it were the greatest thing since aerosol cheese. This is a great country, but it is not so for everyone. It may seem hard for whites to believe, but many people of color actually find it difficult to make it here. Understandably, they may not celebrate America's history with quite the same unqualified enthusiasm. During a recent sermon in my city, one white pastor expressed high praise for America's war on drugs. I could not help thinking how a person of color might feel upon hearing this, given that their communities are so disproportionately targeted, not to mention convicted and incarcerated. Certainly the system seems great if it works for you, but that's because it is engineered to work for white people, especially the affluent ones. In reality, there are two Americas, one for the rich and white, and one for the poor and people of color. If we white pastors really want people of color to stay in our churches, we need to get to know that other America. We need to immerse ourselves in the issues and challenges they face, to talk about things like racism, economic disparity, and injustice. It will do us and our congregations a world of good. You know, people of color also tend to vote differently. You mean it's possible to vote the other way and still get into heaven? Amazing, isn't it? It is time to break out of that white conservative bubble with its narrow agenda and talking points and see how the rest of America lives. Like racism, poverty, too, is another problem that could not exist without us decent folks who turn a blind eye. As a child growing up in a white, affluent bubble, I was taught that America was a land of opportunity, that anyone could make it here if they had a mind to. Therefore, by extrapolation, poor people must have been just lazy. During the 2012 election, this is going back a bit, during the election night coverage on Fox News, commentator Bill O'Reilly, you remember him, was asked how the race became so tight. "Because it's a changing country," he replied bitterly. "The demographics are changing. It's not a traditional America anymore. And there are 50% of the voting public who want stuff. They want things. The white establishment is now the minority, and the voters, many of them feel that this economic system is stacked against them, and they want stuff. You're going to see a tremendous Hispanic vote for President Obama, overwhelming black vote for President Obama, and women will probably break Obama's way too. People feel that they are entitled to things." Well, one has come to expect outrageous and inflammatory comments from polarizing figures like O'Reilly. Such intolerance draws viewers. What hurts and offends much more deeply is to hear such things repeated on the lips of one's fellow Christians or on their Facebook pages. Yet this too should not surprise us. Throughout the history of the church, Christians have often found themselves on the wrong side of the struggle for justice. Tragically, the very movement the Almighty intended for the uplifting of a downtrodden world has frequently proved to be a veritable millstone around the neck of human progress. History will not let us forget that Hitler was swept to power with the aid of German Christians. Slavery could not have continued to exist in the American South and indeed elsewhere without the assistance of the pulpit, just as abolitionism could not have spread without the same. The civil rights movement finds its roots in Christian theology. Even Mahatma Gandhi owed the inspiration for his theories of passive resistance to Count Leo Tolstoy, the Russian author. Yet the church also nursed some of Dr. King's fiercest opponents. And too often the church has sacrificed itself on the altar of the status quo instead of on the altar of justice. O'Reilly's comments go beyond mere partisan politics. They are sadly elitist, racist, and sexist, designed to appeal to a narrow and shrinking section of white male society that has always feared the advancement of women and people of color. O'Reilly would like to portray half of America as lazy, dependent, on the dole, taking and contributing nothing, expecting government to meet all their needs. Unfortunately, his whining makes him the poster child of privileged white victimhood, which continues to shut its ears to the cries around it, as if we did not have 400 years of oppression and violence against people of color in this country, as if we have always had a level playing field. It reminds us of Pharaoh's rebuke to Moses. Lazy, that's what you are, lazy. You have too much time on your hands. That's why you're asking for these things. Now go back to your bricks. Why is it that this so-called 50%, what is it that this so-called 50% really want? It is true, they do want stuff. Stuff like the right to vote without being harassed. Stuff like equal pay for equal work, a living wage, a chance at getting a college education, a fair shot at the American dream. Stuff like the rich and corporations paying their fair share of taxes and being able to walk down the street without being stopped and frisked, or worse, gunned down. It is normal for people to feel disappointment, even resentment, when their side loses an election. My concern is that if Christians find balm in voices like O'Reilly's, as they have over the past 2 elections, and they learn nothing from this experience, if they become recalcitrant and even more firmly entrenched in a fading worldview, if they continue to ally themselves with the forces of racism, sexism, and economic inequality, they will find themselves increasingly marginalized and irrelevant. It is honorable to be marginalized because one follows in the footsteps of Jesus Christ, but it is foolish to become irrelevant because one has allied oneself with an elite and selfish power structure bent on preserving its own privileges. American Christians are generous people. They do an admirable job at giving things to the poor, yet they frequently neglect something just as important, and that is to speak on behalf of the poor, to speak prophetically against corrupt power structures and systemic injustice. As Martin Luther King Jr. said, true compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It comes to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. Christians ought to know that our calling is not just to be charitable, but also to be champions for the poor and weak, not just to give alms, but to advocate for those who suffer injustice. The Bible makes this plain. The kingdom of God is very good news for the oppressed, but bad news for the rich and powerful. In Psalm 12, the psalmist writes, "Because the poor are plundered and the needy groan, I will now arise, says the Lord. I will protect them from those who malign them." In Luke 1, it's written, "He has scattered those who are proud in their inmost thoughts. He has brought down rulers from their thrones, but has lifted up the humble. He has filled the hungry with good things, but has sent the rich away empty." As Dr. King taught, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Well, Bill O'Reilly is right about one thing. This country is changing. In the very near future, white Americans, whom O'Reilly equates with, quote, traditional America, unquote, will be the minority. This is an indisputable and unavoidable fact, and people are scared. A preliminary tremor of this silent but inevitable shift is the fact that no presidential candidate can now win election without capturing the Hispanic vote. It is ironic that the traditional America we speak about so glowingly was in fact built upon tremendous inequality and injustice. White Christians now have an imperative opportunity to stop lecturing the poor and start listening to them, to cease whining for a golden past that never really existed, except in our selective memory, and to pull up a chair and realize we are rapidly becoming no longer the only dominant force, but one of many voices in an increasingly diverse nation. As I've stated before on this broadcast, I normally do not take sides in partisan races. As a follower of Christ, I feel my real loyalty lies with the poor and oppressed rather than with any political faction or ideology. Political parties are perhaps the greatest instrument of crowd control ever devised by government. They keep the lower classes and Christians at each other's throats, anathematizing each other lest they band together to begin solving the real problems, such as poverty, racism, rampant militarism, economic inequality, and other forms of injustice. With the current state of partisan politics in this country, I strongly feel that if my fellow believers can easily cast their vote for either party without at least some kind of semblance of a crisis of conscience, then they are not thinking biblically. In the 2012 presidential election, again, candidate Mitt Romney, remember this, was castigated for his insensitive, albeit off-the-cuff remarks regarding poverty in America. Suddenly, poverty became an issue in the election, although up to that time both candidates had been largely silent on the subject. Romney's comments, once revealed, may have cost him the election. Yet it is not only his statements, but also the response from many of his Christian supporters, decent folks, that demonstrates an astounding lack of understanding. It would perhaps be helpful to address some of the common myths regarding poverty that people carry these days, a mindset which is completely inappropriate and incongruous for Christians to hold. Myth number 1. That people on food stamps are inherently lazy. We may be surprised to learn that the vast majority of the poor are very hardworking. They have to be if they want to survive. 2/3 hold more than one job, and yet they are still considered underemployed in terms of income. The idea that they could rise out of poverty suddenly merely by working harder at low-wage jobs is naive, if not downright heartless. Myth number 2. Food stamps and other entitlement programs beget dependency and lack of initiative. Doubtless there are problems with the system and vast room for improvement, yet have you ever tried to live on food stamps or public assistance? The average monthly welfare check for a single parent with 2 children is around $478. It depends, but it's not a cushy or enviable existence by any stretch of the imagination. Most would gladly do without these supports if they could. But what alternatives do they have? Borrow money from their parents to go to college, as one politician once put it. The idea that women are encouraged by the system to have more babies is also ludicrous when you consider that states offer only an average of $60 more a month for an additional child. That would barely pay for diapers. Some states offer only $25 or nothing at all. So dollar for dollar, the middle class has much more incentive to have children through tax breaks and deductions. Myth number 3. Poverty is the result of alcohol or drug use. Well, it's true that addiction, if allowed to progress, often leads to poverty and a host of other crippling problems. Yet while we think of drug use as mostly a problem of our poorer communities and inner cities, the rate of drug use among the poor and minorities is about the same as among the white middle class and wealthy. Did you know that? It just doesn't seem that way since the rate of drug law enforcement, prosecution, and conviction is so heavily tilted against poor communities of color. And this, of course, is no accident. In her groundbreaking book, The New Jim Crow, legal scholar Michelle Alexander documents how the so-called war on drugs was racialized and politicized from its inception. Beginning under Ronald Reagan in the early 1980s, law enforcement specifically and aggressively targeted crack cocaine use in our inner cities, as opposed to regular cocaine, which is more expensive and thus more widely used in white communities. Today, as much as 1/3 of our young African American male population has come under the control of the corrections industry, mostly due to drug-related crimes. According to the newspaper The Guardian, the U.S. has 5% of the world's population, but 25% of its prisoners. Half of all human beings in federal prison are there because of a nonviolent drug offense. The number of nonviolent drug offenders in prisons and jails around America has increased 1,100% since 1980. The vast majority of those in prison are very poor. African Americans constitute only 14 to 15% of the nation's drug users, about the same as their percentage of the general population. Yet they constitute 37% of those arrested for drug offenses, 59% of those convicted for drug offenses, and 74% of those sentenced to prison for drug offense. The result, 20 years or so into the war on drugs, America incarcerated blacks at a rate 6 times higher than South Africa did during apartheid. In 35 of our 50 states, convicted felons have their voting rights either permanently stripped from them or restored only after their period of incarceration and parole have expired. But voting is not the only right denied to those unfortunate enough to fall into the trap set for possessing even a few ounces of marijuana. As Alexander describes, they are branded felons, whether or not they have spent time in prison. They are barred from jury service and, I quote, from public housing by law, discriminated against by private landlords, ineligible for food stamps, forced to check the box indicating a felony conviction on employment applications for nearly every job, and denied licenses for a wide range of professions, unquote. Seen in this light, the war on drugs is in reality a war of political disenfranchisement and economic marginalization against people of color. The felon label ushers the person into what Alexander calls a parallel universe in which discrimination, stigma, and exclusion are perfectly legal and privileges of citizenship off limits, unquote. Our association of drug use with the poor thus conveniently ignores a leading cause of poverty in this country, systemic injustice. Is it merely a coincidence that such a disproportionate share of poverty is found in minority communities? Follow the thread of poverty, and it will lead you to this nation's long and ongoing history of injustice and racism. Yet poverty is not just a minority issue. Whites still have the largest share of it. Around 47% of the poor are white. Myth number 4, that this is a land of opportunity. Anyone can rise to realize his or her potential. Well, this may still hold true if one is born white, and at least middle class. The horizon for the poor and for many people of color, however, is not so rosy. Believing these myths is enormously convenient, as it requires absolutely no soul-searching effort or change on one's own part. With a wave of the hand, one can dismiss half of one's fellow citizens, as well as one's own personal responsibility in perpetuating injustice. Myth number 5. The church should take care of the poor. It's not government's responsibility. It's true both the Old and New Testaments clearly command God's people to care for the poor. Apparently, however, the church neither takes this mandate as seriously as it should, nor has it nearly the level of resources required to fulfill such a massive obligation without at least working in partnership with government. Read the Hebrew prophets. It's clear what God expects from government, whether godly or pagan, that it should be a guardian for the poor and protect them from exploitation, robbery, and wrong. That it takes seriously its role as protector of the weak and not show favoritism to the rich. Myth number 6. Charity should be voluntary. It was so under the Old Testament. Yes and no. Israelites were commanded to help the poor whenever they could, but they were also required to pay a tax or tithe in accordance with their income, a portion of which went to the maintenance of the poor. No, we're not under Old Testament civil law today, and yes, ancient Israel was a theocracy, yet the Mosaic Law demonstrates important principles that show us what pleases God. They form part of the foundation for all Western systems of law, as well as as to reveal a divine intention or goal for good government. Sadly, the mindset among too many middle-class and affluent white voters in this country is, I've got mine, go get yours. It's too true that the majority of us have no concept what it is like growing up in a racially divided and economically unjust nation. We often act as if we had worked and slaved to gain everything we have without considering that we were handed a great deal from the start, that the system is in fact rigged to work for us, but not for others. St. John Chrysostom was an archbishop, preacher, theologian, and a reformer who lived in the early days of the Byzantine Empire around the 4th century A.D. His eloquence and rhetorical gifts posthumously earned him the nickname Golden Mouth, or Chrysostomos. One of Chrysostom's most enduring legacies lies in the homilies that have come down to us by the hundreds. Unfortunately, a dozen or so of these contain some of the most savagely anti-Jewish rhetoric of all patristic writings. Chrysostom seems to be pulling out all the weapons in his vast rhetorical armory to prevent certain members of his flock from lapsing back into Judaism. Yet that's no excuse for the violent hyperbole and intolerance with which he conducts himself in these sermons. Yet fortunately, a more constant and inspiring theme in his sermons is Christ's concern for the poor. John was sometimes more bold than tactful, especially when it came to the excesses of wealth. He's often called an ascetic, yet it must be pointed out that he was not opposed to wealth per se, just against the misuse of it, especially conspicuous consumption and the cruel chasm between rich and poor that characterized the great cities of the empire. One of his favorite biblical texts is the story of the rich man and the beggar Lazarus in Luke 16. There a wealthy man is sent to hell not because of his riches, but because in the midst of his wealth he fails to help other human beings in need, the poorest of the poor, even someone on his very doorstep. While Chrysostom's candor on the selfish mishandling of wealth delighted the masses, it caused him no end of trouble with the ruling classes and clergy. He once railed against the foolish fad among wealthy women of using silver chamber pots, the ultimate in conspicuous consumption. Let's listen in on what he tells them. When Christ is famishing, do you revel in such luxury, act so foolishly? Another, made after the image of God, is perishing of cold, and you're furnishing yourself with such things as these? Oh, the senseless pride! Do you pay such honor to your excrements as to receive them in silver? I know you're shocked at hearing this, but it's the women who do such things who ought to be shocked, and the husbands that minister to such distempers. For this is wantonness and savageness and inhumanity and brutishness and lasciviousness. On more than one occasion, his golden mouth got him into hot water with the imperial household. He once referred to an emperor's notoriously extravagant wife as Herodias. That may have been going too far. In fact, it earned him banishment for life, and he died from exhaustion en route to his place of exile. But he was a man who did not shrink from speaking truth to power. Chrysostom lived at a time not unlike our own, when greed and corruption were rampant. The rich grew richer, and the poor grew poorer. The wealthy feasted and spent money recklessly, while the lower classes starved or groaned under crushing debt, and no one called the powerful to account. He treated as of sovereign importance the Lord's warning in Matthew 25 that our salvation depends on how we treat the poor among us, who are the embodiment of Christ. Let's listen in on a few of these sermons to hear what he has to teach us. This also is robbery, not to impart our good things to others. It is said to be deprivation when we retain these things from others. And in this way, therefore, we are taught that if we do not bestow alms, we shall be treated in the same way as those who have been extortioners. Our Lord's things they are, from whencesoever we may obtain them. And if we distribute to the needy, we shall obtain for ourselves great abundance. And for this it is that God has permitted you to possess much, not that you should spend it in fornication, in drunkenness, in gluttony, in rich clothing, or any other mode of luxury, but that you should distribute it to the needy. And just as if the receiver of taxes, having in charge the king's property, should not distribute it to those for whom it is ordered, but should spend it for his own enjoyment, he would pay the penalty and come to ruin. Thus also the rich man is, as it were, a receiver of goods which are destined to be dispensed to the poor, to those of his fellow servants who are in want. If he then should spend upon himself more than he really needs, he will pay hereafter a heavy penalty, for the things he has are not his own, but are the things of his fellow servants. Not to share our own riches with the poor is a robbery of the poor, and a depriving them of their livelihood, and that which we possess is not only our own, but also theirs. Tell me then, what is the source of your wealth? From whom did you receive it, and from whom the one who transmitted it to you? From his father and his grandfather. But can you go back through the many generations and show the acquisition was just? It cannot be. The root and origin of it must have been injustice. Why? Because God, in the beginning, did not make one man rich and another poor, nor did he later show one treasures of gold and deny the other the right to search for them. He left the earth free to all alike. Why then, if it is common, do you have so many acres of land while your neighbor has no portion of it? If to us Chrysostom's program for the distribution of wealth smacks of socialism, we need only refer to the Bible to find his inspiration. The Old Testament laws lay out for us God's ideal of a more economically just society. From the beginning, every Israelite tribe and clan is given a share of the land. Yet the Almighty knows the inclination of the human heart is ever toward greed and acquisitiveness, and that the weak will always be left behind or taken advantage of. And to counteract these tendencies, he introduces numerous laws that command generosity and protect the poor from becoming prey. If these should fail, however, as he knows they shall, he institutes a kind of divine reset button called the Jubilee. Every 50th year, all debts are to be canceled, bondservants released, and property returned to its original owner. Unfortunately, there is no actual record that Israel ever kept this law. They may have, there's just no record that they ever did, perhaps a testament to the obduracy of human greed. And certainly today arguments can be made that such civil laws were intended for an Israelite theocracy, yet at the very least they show us what pleases and displeases our Maker and what he thinks about poverty and wealth. As such, they may serve as a guide to Christian living, a view which is both consistent with a third use of the law, as it appears in Lutheran and Reformed traditions. The New Testament is not so much concerned with how society is to be structured, however, but rather how the believer is to live his or her life as they await Christ's coming, an apocalyptic event the apostles and gospel writers believe to be imminent. Jesus treats as inimical anything that holds the disciple back from following him wholeheartedly, and including wealth. Charity that is praised in both the Gospels and letters is that which goes above and beyond one's duty and demonstrates faith in God's promises, yet unseen. Sacrificial, joyful, and extravagant giving. The inbreaking reign of heaven completely inverts the worldly economic system of haves and have-nots. The poor, hungry, grieving, and oppressed are declared fortunate, since their condition of emptiness places them in a position of dependence upon God's faithful provision and of eager expectation of the kingdom's final consummation, while the rich, satiated and celebrated, cannot even crash the party, but must turn up like beggars at the door. The first church in Acts 4 gives us a glimpse of how a relatively poor but Spirit-filled New Testament community puts these principles into practice. Acts 4 tells us all the believers were in one heart and mind. No one claimed that any of his possessions was their own, but they shared everything they had. With great power, the apostles continued to testify to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and God's grace was so powerfully at work in them all that there were no needy persons among them. For from time to time those who owned land or houses sold them, brought the money from the sales, and put it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to anyone who had need. Chrysostom's views are not unique or untypical of the early church fathers' teaching on poverty and the use of wealth. If he sometimes erred in decorum or spoke too passionately, it was from a sincere conviction that the church must accurately reflect the compassion and generosity of Christ. Yet in both his tone and zeal he is not unlike the Hebrew prophets, and indeed the Lord himself, both of whom spoke scathingly against leaders for their dereliction of duty toward the poor and their tolerance of economic injustice. In Act 3 of J.B. Priestley's play An Inspector Calls, written in 1945, as Police Inspector Gould prepares to leave, he turns to the gathered and delivers an ominous warning. He says, "Well, Eva Smith's gone. You can't do her any more harm, and you can't do her any good now either. You can't even say, "I'm sorry, Eva Smith." But just remember this, one Eva Smith has gone, but there are millions and millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths still left with us, with their lives, their hopes and fears, their suffering and chances of happiness, all intertwined with our lives and what we think and say and do. We don't live alone. We are members of one body. We are responsible for one another. And I tell you that the time will come when, if men will not learn that lesson, then they will be taught it in fire and blood and anguish. Earlier that evening, Gould arrives at the home of wealthy industrialist Arthur Burling to ask a few questions regarding the suicide of one Eva Smith, a poor young woman who had been a worker in Burling's factory. It seems the deceased had swallowed some kind of disinfectant and died in agony. Unfortunately for investigators, she left a diary detailing her descent from poverty to starvation and despair. The visit is just a routine inquiry, so the family thinks, until one by one, under the inspector's withering interrogation, they all somehow find themselves deeply implicated in this woman's tragic death. 2 years earlier, Mr. Burling had fired Eva from his factory after she had led a deputation of workers to ask for higher wages. Routine business practice, Burling insists. His daughter, Sheila, has also had a run-in with the girl, who after her dismissal found employment at an upscale department store. Unfortunately, Eva quite innocently gets caught between the upper and nether millstones of Mrs. Burling and her daughter, who in a sudden pique insists the shopgirl be fired for her impertinence. Sheila felt badly about the incident at the time, but now feels absolutely wretched to have been the cause or part of the cause of Eva's demise. Gould is not through, however, as there's plenty more guilt to go around. Enter Gerald, Miss Burling's fiancé, who happens to be there to celebrate his engagement. It seems he, too, has a history with this woman who, unable to find work, was hungry and desperate enough to flirt with prostitution. The trade does not suit her, however, and Gerald, recognizing her sweet nature and innocence, steps in to rescue her, setting her up in an apartment and carrying on an affair for several months. Sadly, it's the happiest Eva has ever been, though she knows it will be short-lived owing to the gulf between their two classes. Not surprisingly, Gerald eventually wants out since he is about to be engaged to Sheila, and Eva nobly lets him go. The last stages of Eva's descent are tawdry. Taken to selling her body, she happens upon a young man whom she feels sorry for because, although clearly wealthy, he seems lonely and drinks too much. In one of his drunken stupors, he rapes her, but they continue their relationship. She becomes pregnant with his child. He offers to marry her, but she knows he does not love her, and his family would never approve the match. The young man offers her money, which he has stolen from his father's firm. At her absolute bottom, she appeals for help from a charity run by who else but Mrs. Burling, the industrialist's wife, who flatly does not believe her story and tells her to find the child's father and demand that he marry her or else expose him publicly. And so, rejected by the charity, Eva decides to end her life and that of her unborn child. Mrs. Burling, not a woman to be trifled with, resents the inspector's line of questioning and insists she has done nothing wrong. Instead, she doubles down on her insistence that the child's father is really responsible for the woman's death and should be publicly disgraced. Now comes the final coup de grace, for the child's father is none other than the Burling's rakish son, Eric. Like his sister, he is at least authentically heartbroken over his behavior and outraged at his parents' heartlessness. Ironically, he is the only one who has actually done anything illegal. As for the other three, their cruelty toward a poor worker is simply standard operating procedure for the upper middle class, who prey upon the weak and vulnerable not because they have to, but because they can. His work done, Inspector Gould prepares to go, but not before he delivers the spectre-like warning I quoted before. an oddly sermonic note for a police officer. Or is he one? As the third act plays out, the family learns that there is in fact no such person as Inspector Gould of the local constabulary. Not only that, they also learn from the local infirmary that there have been no such suicides recently. They've been diddled, or so they think. Who would play such a trick? Well, no matter. Immediately, the elder generation goes to work congratulating themselves on a narrow escape. It has all been just a bad practical joke. What a relief. Now at last things can go back to normal. The children, however, aren't having it. They are horrified that their parents and Gerald have learned absolutely nothing from such a harrowing experience. For Eric, the material point is that they all are guilty of mistreating this woman, whether she is alive or dead. For Sheila, she's had a ghastly long look at herself in the mirror, an experience for which she won't soon recover. But even this soul-searching comes too late. The phone rings. It's the police department. A woman has committed suicide, and an inspector has been dispatched to ask the family some questions. Such a queer ending. It leaves as many questions as answers. Who was the inspector? Some supernatural being, as his name, Ghoul, implies? If not, how did he know about Eva's death before it happened? Or is it again Eva who is dead? The only thing we can be sure about is that the Burling family, having survived one ordeal and lived to boast about it, is about to go through another. It's no coincidence that the play takes place in 1912, before the First World War, but was written after the Second. It appears the author would have us question why one world war was not enough, why the world did not learn its lesson the first time. But which lesson? Priestley, as a socialist, is intent on exposing the cruelties and excesses of capitalism and exploding the myth that it lulls us into believing that we are responsible only for ourselves, or in Mr. Burling's words at the beginning of the play, a man has to mind his own business and look after himself and his own. One is reminded of the remorseful words of Jacob Marley's ghost, the deceased partner of Ebenezer Scrooge in Dickens' classic tale. Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, benevolence were all my business. The dealings of my trade were but a drop of water in the comprehensive ocean of my business. At this season of the year, while others maskless may be celebrating together with food and drink, heedless of the risks they may be imposing on others, it's a good thing if we must curtail our normal Yuletide festivities and consider those around us, that we are indeed all connected, one with the other, responsible for one another. This pandemic has shown a spotlight on the many inequalities that exist in this nation, both ethnic and economic, and it has also provided many opportunities for us to reach out, to speak out, and to share from our table. In the words of Jonathan Winthrop, the Puritan governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony, now the only way to avoid this shipwreck and to provide for our posterity is to follow the counsel of Micah, to do justly, to love mercy, to walk humbly with our God. For this end we must be knit together in this work as one man. We must entertain each other in brotherly affection. We must be willing to abridge ourselves of our superfluities for the supply of others' necessities. We must uphold a familiar commerce together in all meekness, gentleness, patience, and liberality. We must delight in each other, make others' conditions our own, rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together, always having before our eyes our commission and community in the work as members of the same body. So then, in this coming year, let us resolve to put others first, to begin to take a genuine interest in their welfare, to undo old wrongs, address old grievances, to tear down walls, and instead to build bridges. In the words of the prophet Isaiah, as I've quoted before on this program, to loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and break every yoke, to share your food with the hungry and to provide the poor wanderer with shelter, when you see the naked to clothe them, and not to turn away from your own flesh and blood. This is Pastor S J Munson, thanking you for tuning into this broadcast. And wishing you a wonderful holiday season, and good night.